The morning mist still lingered over the training yard as Evan and his canine dog Shadow moved with determined steps. In that quiet moment, Shadow noticed a silent signal from a missing girl. A small but powerful sign. What the dog did next didn't just save her, it changed their lives forever. This story of trust and loyalty will keep you on the edge of your seat. Are you ready to discover this incredible moment? The early morning fog rolled over the grassy slopes like a thin silver veil draping itself across the quiet outskirts. The first light of day had yet to pierce the mist, leaving behind only a muted, warm glow that glimmered on the dewdrops clinging to each blade of grass. Every breath of morning carried the damp scent of earth, the faint resin of pine, and a whisper of steel from the nearby training grounds. In that stillness, steady footsteps pressed into the damp sand, accompanied by the faint metallic jingle of a chain shifting with each stride. Evan emerged from the narrow path that led into the training yard. He wore a deep green trainer's jacket, its shoulders faded from countless mornings, just like this one. His short hair was tousled slightly by the wind, and his gray-blue eyes held the focused calm of someone who had weathered hundreds of hours of intense canine drills. Every movement he made carried the quiet certainty of a professional handler, someone who didn't need many words to inspire complete trust. At his side was Shadow, a black-coated German shepherd, whose fur gleamed like velvet under the soft light. His ears stood sharp, his gaze deep and sharp as obsidian catching the first kiss of dawn. Every step Shadow took was sure and fluid, as if he could feel the heartbeat of the ground beneath him. His long tail swayed with an easy rhythm, but his eyes never stopped moving, reading the space around them with the ingrained habit of years of discipline. As they entered the yard, a breeze swept through, making the red command flag at the far corner ripple faintly. Evan stopped, looked down at Shadow, and the dog met his gaze instantly, awaiting instruction. Their bond needed no words. Evan lifted his hand, tilting his finger to the left. Shadow moved at once, weaving smoothly through the row of upright wooden posts, slipping between narrow gaps with perfect speed and precision. The sound of his claws touching the sand blended with the wind, creating a rhythm only those who had shared enough mornings like this could recognize. Evan walked parallel a few paces away, his eyes following each subtle motion of Shadow's body. He knew what every head tilt meant, every flick of the eyes, a silent language only they shared. When the obstacle run ended, Evan signaled for Shadow to stop before a zigzag row of wooden crates. With a short hand gesture, he began the silent signal drill, a key exercise in training Shadow to respond to the smallest movements from someone in need. Stepping back into the pale mist, Evan's expression shifted, his hands sweeping in a subtle arc. Shadow didn't hesitate. He curved right, approached the target dummy placed in the far corner, lowered his body and locked his gaze on it. Their seamless coordination was the product of thousands of repetitions. Yet each time, Evan could still feel the spark of Shadow's drive. This was more than obedience. Shadow was fully engaged, listening with every sense. When the drill was over, Evan knelt and patted Shadow's shoulder. The dog stepped closer, his eyes softening, warm breath washing over Evan's hand. In that moment, Evan felt the thing every canine handler longs for: absolute trust. Not blind faith, but trust built through every dawn, every hour of work, every challenge faced together. Far off, the fog began to lift, revealing low buildings washed in the gold of the rising sun. A sharp whistle signaled the next drill, breaking the calm. Evan rose, motioning for Shadow to get ready. He didn't know that within days, the skills they were honing this morning would become critical in a mission that would test both Shadow's instincts and Evan's heart. And as they moved across the yard, the mist lingering behind them felt like the quiet prologue to a day neither of them would ever forget. By late afternoon, the sky deepened into shades of amber, the last streaks of sunlight cutting through the rescue unit's office windows and laying narrow bands of gold across the tiled floor. Evan had just finished Shadow's final training of the day when the sharp blare of the emergency bell rang out. A clean cutting sound that sliced through the air like a cold blade. He glanced at the clock. The minute hand had just touched 6. Usually the hour when shifts began to wind down, but not today. On the central screen, a flashing red line of text appeared. Missing. Clara Walker, 16 years old. Brief but loaded with the urgency everyone in the field understood. Every passing minute was the thin line between rescue and loss. Within minutes, Evan was in the coordination room. A young officer, his face still carrying the strain of urgency, read aloud the summary. Clara had vanished around 11 a.m., last seen near the old market a few blocks from her home. Friends said she had gone to buy a birthday gift for her younger sister, but never came back. Her phone was later found abandoned on a street corner screen, shattered edges scraped fresh. The room seemed to tighten with unspoken pressure. Team members moved quickly. Tasks split the district map glowing on the wall with red markers marking search zones. A voice came through the loudspeaker. The family is waiting in the first-floor lounge. Need someone to speak with them. Evan descended the stairs. Shadow close at his side. The scent of the old hospital hallway. Disinfectant mingled with the faint wood of the stair rails. Wrapped around him carrying that familiar weight before a search mission. When the lounge door opened, he saw a couple seated close together on the bench. The mother, with long brown hair hanging loose, gripped a knitted scarf so tightly her knuckles were pale. The father in a gray shirt stared down at the floor, his shoulders trembling slightly. As Evan stepped inside, they rose at once, their eyes wide with hope and fear. "Please, find her." The mother's voice trembled as if it took every ounce of strength to form the words. In her gaze, Evan saw more than fear. He saw the fragile thread of hope clinging desperately to any light it could find. He took a seat across from them, his voice low and steady as he asked about the moments leading up to Clara's disappearance. Piece by piece, the picture formed that morning. Clara had left home in high spirits, a small blue backpack slung over her shoulder. At 10:15, she sent her younger sister a final text promising to bring home a cake. But after that, all communication ceased. No one had seen her return home, nor had she been spotted at the bakery she intended to visit. When the father mentioned the broken phone, his tone sank as though the image of something terrible had just taken shape in his mind. Evan placed a hand on the man's shoulder. A brief gesture, but enough to carry the unspoken vow. "We will do everything we can." Shadow sat beside him, gaze fixed on the mother, his head tilted slightly. It was as if he could sense the storm of emotion filling the room. In those dark eyes, Evan saw readiness, not the kind born of drills, but of a deep, instinctive urge to protect. Back in the coordination room, the team was already gathering gear. Radios, printed maps, flashlights, and protective clothing. The air had shifted into a state of focused urgency. On the map, the search radius had expanded into the outskirts, a sprawl of abandoned warehouses and an old lot littered with rusting cars. Evan knew this was a complicated sector, a place with a history of small-scale disappearances. A team leader's voice cut through the room. "Evan, you and Shadow will cover the west perimeter. Sweep every building, every alley. If you find anything, call it in immediately." Evan nodded his hand, making a subtle signal to Shadow out of habit. Outside the window, the last light of sunset had faded into a pale violet shadow seeping into every corner of the streets. It struck Evan then. Within hours, darkness would claim the city, and in cases like this time, was a weapon in the abductor's hands. He could feel his heartbeat in sync with Shadow's, faster, sharper driven. Before leaving headquarters, he took a photograph of Clara from the dispatch desk. In it, she smiled brightly, hazel eyes catching the sunlight. He studied it intently, committing every detail to memory, knowing that in the dark sometimes one fleeting glimpse was all you had to follow. Shadow stood beside him, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the doorway. He seemed to understand this was no routine patrol. Evan tightened the lead, and together they stepped outside. Twilight had deepened into that watchful, in-between light that sharpened every instinct. Somewhere out there, Clara was waiting. And from this moment on, the search began. Driven by the pressure of time, the weight of a family's hope, and the singular goal of bringing her home safe. Their shadows stretched long beneath the glow of newly lit street lamps, two silent arrows aimed at the darkness swallowing the city. By the time they left the heart of the city for the western outskirts, the sky had swallowed the last traces of sunset. The old neighborhood sprawled ahead, rows of silent buildings broken by pockets of overgrown lots. The night wind carried the damp breath of the river, curling through cobbled lanes and along walls mottled with moss. The rescue vehicle stopped at the edge of an abandoned factory complex. Headlights swept over the road, glinting off shards of glass and rusted cans scattered across the ground. Evan stepped out the door hinge, creaking softly, and crouched to secure Shadow's lead. Under the jaundiced glow of a street lamp, the black sheen of Shadow's coat caught the light, every muscle ripple beneath the fur, defined with sharp clarity. The dog leaned forward, ears high, drawing in the scents that threaded through the night air. This district had once been a thriving industrial hub, but decades of neglect had left it hollow. The warehouse walls were scarred with peeling brick, their metal doors warped and hanging. In the empty yards between them, grass grew waist-high, concealing hazards. Scrap metal sudden drops. Every step Evan took was measured, knowing that one careless move could cost them the trail. Or worse, expose them to unseen danger. Shadow led steadily, pausing at a corner where a fresh scratch marred the faded paint. Evan knelt his flashlight, revealing small flakes of paint on the ground, mixed with thin strands of blue fabric, matching the color of Clara's backpack. His pulse quickened, but discipline kept his thoughts clear. They moved on, threading between two warehouse rows. A faint chain of footprints marked the damp earth. Small steps, likely female, occasionally overlapped by deeper, heavier prints. Evan glanced at Shadow, who had already read the same sign. The dog's nose skimmed low tail, stiffening his focus absolute. Wind hissed through gaps in the corrugated roofs, its voice like a drawn-out moan, mingling with the sharp clatter of loose doors knocking against their frames. The chill seeped through Evan's jacket, bringing with it the metallic tang of rust and the musty weight of old stone. The unease here was not sharp fear, but a steady pressing presence that made each breath feel heavier. They stopped at a section of collapsed wall, peering into the yard behind a larger warehouse. The beam of Evan's flashlight swept over piles of old crates, some rotting open to reveal coiled ropes and stiff tarpaulins. He picked up a frayed rope, one end still knotted tight. He didn't speak, just met Shadow's eyes, and found in them the same steady resolve, ready to push deeper. The ground grew more tangled as they turned onto a narrow path running along the far wall. Clumps of wild grass rose like barricades, some thick with thorn, forcing Evan to cut a way through. The flashlight cast shifting circles of light across the earth, stretching the shadows of man and dog into the deeper dark ahead. Shadow stopped abruptly, ears pricked forward, head tilting slightly, as a faint sound drifted from somewhere ahead. A soft clink like metal rolling gently across concrete. In an instant, Evan switched off his flashlight and signaled for Shadow to move silently. In the darkness, their senses sharpened, every sound and shift in the air magnified. They drew closer to a small half-buried hatch, its lid ajar. A cold breath seeped from within, carrying the mingled scent of old machine oil and years of damp decay. Evan angled the beam briefly inside. Narrow iron steps descended into a tight corridor. On one step, a faded reddish-brown stain clung to the metal long dried. He couldn't be certain what it was, but the tug in his gut grew stronger. Experience told him not to dive in yet. He marked the location on his map, jotting quick notes for the team. Before leaving, he glanced upward. The crescent moon had broken free from the clouds, spilling a pale ribbon of light across the yard, catching in Shadow's dark eyes. That gaze held both vigilance and an unspoken promise. We'll find her. Back on the main path, the chill from that hatch still clung to his skin. The evidence wasn't enough to prove Clara had been here, but the fragments were beginning to form a pattern. And he knew. With each passing minute, their pace had to quicken, because time outside would not slow for anyone. Their shadows stretched long down the narrow track leading toward another row of warehouses, silent as sleeping giants. Moonlight threaded through gaps in the corrugated roofs, casting thin silver stripes across the gravel-strewn ground. The night wind still carried the damp, musty bite of decay. But now, another note cut through it, sharp enough to halt Shadow mid-step. The dog froze, head dipping low nose, nearly brushing the damp earth. His breaths slowed deeper now, as if he were filtering each trace of scent through 1,000 nerves. Evan saw the shift instantly. He knew this was the moment when Shadow locked onto something significant. The smell was strange, tinged with the acrid weight of old oil and the metallic tang of rust. But beneath it lay another thread, faint as a hairline, carrying the warmth of human scent. Evan couldn't detect it himself, but he read it in Shadow's body, the taut line of his neck ears, high but angling slightly left tail, rigid and still. Without a word, Shadow began to move, each step deliberate, following the invisible trail. Evan stayed close, his eyes tracking every reaction from his partner. They crossed an open stretch of cracked pavement, once a parking lot, now marked only by faded paint lines and a few lonely concrete posts. When the wind shifted, Shadow veered right toward a warehouse with a dented steel door gaping just wide enough for a person to slip through. Evan crouched, sending his flashlight beam into the gap. Inside was a dense, heavy dark, thick with the smell of rust and oil. Light skimmed over old steel drums, some still streaked with grease, glinting silver where the beam touched. On the concrete floor, faint drag marks stretched across the dust as if something heavy had been pulled recently. Shadow stepped forward, nose hovering just above the marks. His breathing, quickening eyes locked into the gloom. Evan felt the urgency building in both of them. Years in the field had taught him one unshakable truth. When Shadow chose a direction, his trust was absolute. He unclipped the lead, a practiced move for giving Shadow freedom in tight quarters. "Go, my friend," he whispered, just loud enough for the dog to hear. Shadow slipped through the gap pause, moving with a quiet, coiled strength, avoiding unnecessary noise. Inside, the air thickened colder now, and the scent of oil grew sharper, mingling with the sour musk of rotting timber. Shadow led him past towering stacks of old crates, some partially collapsed, to reveal dark, hollow spaces beneath. From time to time, the dog paused, inhaled deeply at a spot, then pressed on as though following an unbroken scent line. Evan's flashlight swept low, catching a smudge of faded reddish-brown on the concrete near the far wall. It was impossible to confirm what it was, but its position lined up exactly with Shadow's route. His pulse jumped. Every fragment mattered, each one a possible thread to Clara. The further they moved, the tighter the space became. At the end of the passage, a small steel door came into view, bound by a chain rusted with age. Shadow stopped there, inhaling sharply at the narrow gap, then suddenly turned to look at Evan. In those eyes was something urgent, part confirmation, part warning. Evan stepped forward, pressing a hand to the cold metal. From within came the faintest sound. Something shifting or breathing. He held still, straining to separate the noise from the wind. For a moment, his own breathing synced with Shadow's, fast-taut, brimming with anticipation. Protocol demanded he call it in before breaching. Evan raised his radio, transmitting their position and requesting backup. When he turned back, Shadow hadn't moved, gaze fixed on that narrow gap, ears angled to catch every scrap of sound. The beam from the flashlight lit the strong lines of Shadow's face, catching the deep, unwavering focus in his eyes. If there was one thing Evan trusted beyond question, it was this dog's instincts. And right now, they were telling him they were close. Very close. Outside, the night wind scraped across the old tin roofs, but here every sound felt swallowed, held in the kind of silence that waits for truth to break through. The steel door stood cold and unmoving before them. But with backup still minutes away, Evan decided to use the time to gather anything the scene would give. If Clara had been here, someone, somewhere nearby, might have seen or heard something. Even the smallest sign could be the key. This warehouse complex sat at the edge of the old neighborhood where only a scattering of houses remained occupied. Most who still lived here were either lifelong residents unwilling to leave, or wanderers who treated the abandoned buildings as makeshift shelter. Stepping out from the dented steel door, Evan drew a long breath of the cold night air. The moon had climbed higher, pouring its silver light across the weed-dotted pavement. Shadow kept close, occasionally lifting his head to take in a quick breath, as if storing the scent trail in memory. They turned into a narrow alley where the single street lamp flickered as though it might die at any moment. Beneath an old maple tree, a homeless man sat with his back to the wall, wrapped in a thin, faded blanket. Evan approached, voice warm yet firm. "Did you see or hear anything unusual around the warehouses tonight?" The man looked up, his clouded eyes catching a glint of curiosity at the sight of Shadow. He shook his head, saying he usually slept early but recalled waking some time past midnight to the sound of metal clanging together. He couldn't pinpoint where it came from, only that it echoed from the direction of the western warehouses. Evan made a quick note, thanked him, and moved on. Not far ahead, on the porch of a corrugated roof house, a middle-aged woman was mending a shirt under the yellow light spilling from inside. When asked, she hesitated before admitting that 2 nights ago she had heard a motorbike stop near the warehouses. Then came hurried footsteps, followed by silence. She hadn't gone to check. It was too late, but the abrupt end to the noise had left her uneasy. The fragments were adding up, but not yet enough to form a clear picture. Evan was about to head back when a small figure appeared at the end of the alley. An elderly woman, slightly hunched, walking slowly with a cane. Her face was lined deep with age, but her eyes shone unusually bright under the moonlight. She stopped when she saw them. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "You're with the search team?" Evan nodded. She glanced at Shadow and smiled faintly before speaking again. "Last night I heard someone talking near the warehouses. Couldn't make out the words. The voices were low, almost whispering. Then, something fell heavy, hitting the concrete. Each word struck him like a small knock at the back of his mind. He didn't press her for more. He knew that memories in an echoing place like this could be unreliable. But one detail stayed with him. She said it happened at the hour when every house nearby had gone dark. In that stillness, the sound had been sharp, deliberate. Like someone trying not to be heard, while Evan spoke, Shadow stayed still, eyes fixed toward the direction she indicated. His instincts seemed to recognize the thread of connection. Evan's hand slid over Shadow's head in quiet agreement. When they returned to the steel door, the support team had arrived with lock cutters and high-powered lights. Evan quickly relayed the fresh information, emphasizing how each clue pointed toward the western side of the complex. One teammate said they'd begin sweeping the neighboring buildings that night. But for Evan, the most telling clue wasn't in anyone's story. It was in Shadow's reaction. The dog's attention to that direction matched the lingering scent trail they'd found earlier. He paused, took a breath, and looked at Shadow. "Lead the way, my friend." Shadow moved ahead, muscles taut, ears sharp, nose sweeping low over the ground. In that moment, Evan realized the scattered, hesitant accounts from these silent witnesses had given them an invisible map. And it was his and Shadow's job to turn it into a road that led straight to Clara. Their silhouettes slipped back into the dark, leaving behind only the whisper of wind through the old tin roofs, like a quiet score for the next act of the hunt. Moonlight still hung high, scattering silver across the weathered roofs. But the yard before the cluster of warehouses seemed wrapped in a deeper shadow. Here the wind carried the scent of rust oil and a damp chill that crept through clothing to skin. Evan and Shadow approached on soft steps over gravel-strewn ground. The buildings stood pressed close together, forming a hulking block of concrete linked by narrow passageways. Every steel door was rusted hinges, bent, some chained shut with corroded links, others hanging ajar to reveal pockets of absolute dark inside. A lone bulb dangled from a pole, its yellow light trembling in the wind, casting broken fragments of brightness that shivered over the cracked pavement. Shadow halted at the narrow entry between two warehouses, inhaling deeply, ears high. Evan caught the flash in his eyes, a focus edged with urgency. No command was needed. Shadow had locked onto a direction. They slipped through a dented steel door, its hinges groaning low and long. Inside, the dark swallowed the flashlight beam, leaving only a narrow slice of vision ahead. The wind threaded through gaps in the wall, its sound a faint, drawn-out whistle, like someone whispering from hiding. Puddles spotted the concrete, each one throwing back distorted reflections of the light. Every step echoed off the cold walls, sharp at first, then fading away. Shadow moved in front, his black frame merging with the darkness, save for the twin glints of his eyes in the flashlight's reach. The smell of machine oil, thickened here, blended with rotting wood and stale cloth. An oppressive mix designed to mask human scent. But Shadow's pace didn't falter. Each step was as steady as if he walked a path only he could see. The hallway opened into a wider space, ceiling high above, lined with metal racks leaning against the walls. Some had toppled, draped in dust and webs. A single tube light hung askew at the far end, flickering between life and death, making the room shift in pulses between shadow and pallid glow. Evan swept his light to the right and spotted a small door half hidden behind a stack of wooden crates. The marks on the floor told their own story. A long, clean line through the dust where something heavy had been dragged not long ago. Shadow was already there, nose pressed close to the thin gap at the bottom. His body sank low, tail held stiff and straight. Clear signs the scent here was stronger than anywhere else they'd been that night. Evan pressed his ear to the door. The wind outside was gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost solid. Then, faint and deliberate, came a creak from somewhere within, like a rope brushing against metal. He tilted his head toward Shadow. The dog's eyes flashed, pupils tightening, breaths growing sharper. Every signal pointing toward proximity to their quarry. They circled to the rear of the warehouse, following a narrow lane flanked by flaking brick walls where the mortar had crumbled to reveal dark red clay beneath. The wind funneled through gaps, twisting into eerie sounds. At times a long moan, at others a low mocking chuckle. Dry leaves spun across the ground before vanishing into the shadows. At the end of the lane stood a large steel gate, its lock swollen with rust. Evan tried the handle, but it refused to budge. He marked the spot for later, already planning to return with a breach team. Every building here felt like part of a larger labyrinth, each doorway a potential threshold into another hidden space. Shadow showed no impatience. If anything, his composure sharpened, eyes sweeping the scene as if memorizing every contour. Evan knew this was part of what set him apart. Shadow didn't just hunt with his nose. He collected every piece of environmental information, storing it away for later. They paused in a courtyard between two warehouses where moonlight fell unobstructed, revealing more blocks stretching outward. A true maze, each with its own locked doors and its own shadows. Somewhere within these walls, Clara could be waiting. Evan placed a hand on Shadow's shoulder, feeling the warmth and strength there. Their eyes met. No words, just a shared understanding they would keep going until they had an answer. Their silhouettes slipped into the darkness of the next building where yet another battered door opened into a fresh leg of the search. Inside, narrow corridors wound them through black turns where the brick walls drank in the flashlight beam, leaving a heavy, unbroken dark. The wind was gone now, replaced by the tang of rust and the damp chill of a place left untouched for too long. Shadow slowed, lowering his head ears, straining forward. He was following a thread of scent laced with human traces, machine oil, and that metallic chill Evan had learned to trust as a warning. Abruptly, Shadow stopped before a rotting wooden door, its corroded hinges mottled in orange-brown stains. Evan's light skimmed over a narrow gap where the door sat crooked in its frame. Shadow pressed his nose to the slit, then looked up at him. In those deep, shining eyes was a wordless urging. Look now. Evan bent carefully, keeping his movements silent, and peered through. At first, only a tangle of shadow and faint shapes met his gaze. Then suddenly a face emerged, close lit by the weak spill of a single bulb inside. Wide eyes stared back at him, full of fear, but holding steady. Evan recognized them instantly. Clara. She fixed her gaze on him, lifting her bound right hand slowly. The fingers trembled, but the movement was deliberate. She traced an X in the air twice. Evan's heartbeat surged, thudding in his ears. That wasn't random. In rescue training, he'd learned the silent X, repeated, was a distress signal used when a victim couldn't speak or feared being heard. It meant danger or urgent help needed. And now here she was sending it to him. He searched her eyes for confirmation. She gave the slightest nod, urgency sharpening her look. Beyond her, the darkness swallowed everything except the dim light catching on shapes. Metallic, jagged, unmoving. The weight of the moment pressed into his grip on the flashlight. Every second mattered, but any misstep could tip off whoever was holding her. Shadow stood fixed at the door, head tilted, ears locked forward, his body poised to spring. Evan's hand settled on his shoulder, part reassurance, part restraint. He brought a finger to his lips, a reminder to himself, as much as to the dog, absolute silence. Clara's eyes flicked left, quick and subtle, then returned to him. He understood at once. Someone else was there, out of sight. He strained to listen, and then it came, the faint scrape of something shifting on the floor. The air felt denser, pressing in. He eased back from the gap, heart still hammering, and crouched beside Shadow. In the lowest whisper he could manage, he said, "We find another way in. Safe." Shadow moved immediately, threading between leaning racks and crates, guiding Evan away from the main door. Clara's eyes and her X still burned in his mind, a silent command he couldn't ignore. Back in a rear passage, the wind hissed through a wall crack, carrying the groan of a loose hinge. Evan knew from here on, every move had to be fast and exact. Because Clara was close now, and any mistake could tip the balance toward greater danger. Evan tightened his grip on the lead, his gaze fixed on the powerful frame of Shadow ahead. In the darkness of the warehouse maze, they were closing in on the moment where everything would break loose. Just after Evan and Shadow slipped away from the door, Clara remained in the dim room, forcing herself to stay calm. Her wrists still bound, she had traced the X with every ounce of hope that someone outside would understand. But the flicker of hope had barely formed when a harsh, dry sound broke behind her. The scrape of a chair leg as someone stepped closer. A man's voice, low and rasping, pressed close to her ear. "What did you just do?" Clara froze. The sliver of light from the door's edge seemed to shrink, swallowed by the advancing shadow of heavy footsteps. The man moved into view, eyes hard, a length of chain dragging behind him. The links rattled on the cement in a steady, unnerving rhythm, each clink marking time. Just meters away in the outer corridor, Evan caught the echo of the barked words through the wall. He halted instantly, straining to listen. The scrape of metal links merged with the hiss of wind through the cracks, sending a chill down his spine. Inside, the air had shifted, tension tipping toward danger. Clara shifted her chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. She tried to avoid his stare, but he leaned down until his face was inches from hers. Trying to signal someone, he growled. The chain jerked sharply in his hand, wrapping tighter around the base of her chair, anchoring her in place. Metal struck metal with a ringing crack that bounced off the rusted walls, carrying all the way to where Evan and Shadow waited. Shadow's ears snapped forward, body taut as a drawn bow. Evan placed a steadying hand at his neck, keeping him still while his own eyes swept the space for a way in. The man's voice came again, louder now, laced with threat. "No one's coming for you here." Evan's jaw tightened. Clara had been caught trying to make contact. Their silent approach could now dissolve into a direct confrontation. Outside, the wind surged, slipping through the walls and stirring fine dust into ghostly swirls. Dry leaves skittered underfoot as Evan shifted, signaling for Shadow to move toward a side entry, a rotting wooden frame that might connect to the same room. Inside, Clara kept her gaze averted, but in the depths of her eyes, she flicked a glance toward the crack in the door. A silent message, hoping it reached whoever was out there. The man didn't notice. He was too focused on cinching the chain tighter, the metal grinding in long, grating notes. The sound rolled out into the hall, repeating with each echo like hammer strikes. Evan leaned into the cold wall, ear pressed against the surface. Footsteps moved, dragging the chain along, mapping a path in his mind, telling him exactly where the man stood and how far the side door might be from Clara's chair. Shadow turned his head, catching Evan's gaze. The dog's eyes burned in the half-light, reading the smallest hand signal. In that instant, amid wind-flickering shadows and the clink of steel, they both knew they were on the edge of action. Inside, the man stopped scanning the room, as if sensing another presence. Clara held her breath, her heart hammering. Outside, Evan felt it too. Her silent fear carried through the walls. A sharp squeal of rusted hinges split the air, and the heavy steel door at the far end slammed shut with a force that shuddered through the floor. The echo boomed through the emptiness, sealing the space in sudden darkness. The pale light from cracks and the lone hanging bulb was gone, leaving Clara in a suffocating black. She could hear nothing but her own heartbeat and feel the bite of cold chain against her ankle. In the hallway, Evan froze at the sound of the lock. It was the main exit from the room, shut now. Urgency swelled in his chest. Give the man a few minutes and he could fortify the door or move Clara deeper into the maze. Shadow stood rigid beside him, eyes locked toward the noise. In the flashing light from Evan's torch, his gaze burned with readiness. Evan knelt, pressing a hand to his shoulder, grounding him in the moment. In his mind, Evan traced their route, left down the hall to the now blocked main door, right toward the side entrance he'd found. But he knew the way in would be littered with obstacles, metal racks, crates, meaning they needed a plan that was fast and quiet. From inside, the man's slow, deliberate footsteps began again, each step pressing harder into the cement. The chain followed softer now, as though he was holding it low, signaling he was moving Clara. Evan's eyes locked with Shadow's. A single nod passed between them. This was the moment. He drew in a deep breath, the icy air stinging his lungs, and gestured for Shadow to follow as they cut right into the narrow side passage. The walls closed in concrete flaking to reveal dark red brick. Dust lay thick, recording each footstep. The flashlight beam swept over loose wooden panels, some hanging by a single nail, clapping softly against the wall with each gust. Every sound seemed sharper here, every second tighter, as they closed the distance to the door that could take them inside. Near the side door, Evan stopped. The weathered wood was streaked with long cracks, its rusted hinges looking ready to give way under the right force. He pressed his fingertips lightly to the surface, cold and dry beneath his touch. On the other side he listened. No voices, only the faint sweep of wind and the distant, diminishing clink of metal. He turned to Shadow, signaling for him to lower his body. In the darkness, the dog's eyes caught the light. His frame coiled like an arrow drawn to its limit. Evan knew time was running short, but a reckless charge could destroy everything. "Wait for my signal," he murmured, voice steady. He adjusted the position of his flashlight, careful to keep its beam from spilling through the cracks. In his mind, options turned over. Force the door and go in head-on, or find a weaker point to breach. But then the sound came again, the drag of a chain followed by Clara's sharp, hurried breathing. It was a warning. There was no room left for delay. One hand gripped the hinge, the other tightening around Shadow's lead. Both of them were ready, every muscle wound tight. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the break. Beyond the closed steel door, the chain went silent, replaced by a thick, heavy stillness. Evan recognized it instantly. The pause before everything changes. He stood before the fated wood, breathing deep and even, as though syncing his heartbeat with the seconds slipping past. Somewhere behind that wall, Clara was still surrounded by darkness and danger. The chain's scrape and the captor's heavy steps echoed, faintly ticking away what little time they had. The radio hissed with static as a teammate's voice broke through support teams en route. 15 minutes. 15 minutes. To Evan, it might as well have been an eternity in a situation where every breath the hostage took could be her last. He glanced at Shadow, whose eyes shone in the dim halo of the flashlight. No hesitation, no fear, only readiness and unshakable trust. Evan crouched, his hand running along the coarse weave of the lead that had carried them through countless drills and missions. It was more than a tool. It was the tether of their connection, the unspoken pact that Evan led, and Shadow followed without need for words. But now, to face what lay ahead, he knew that tether had to be released. "You ready?" he asked softly, the words, a question and a certainty all at once. Shadow didn't bark. He only tilted his head, ears hightail, giving the faintest shift. In the next beat, Evan unclipped the latch, the soft metallic click loud in the silence, as if unlocking a new chapter. Freed Shadow stepped forward half a pace, lowering his stance muscles strung with stored power. Evan's hand rested on his shoulder. A simple touch, carrying a single message: "I trust you." From the first day they'd met, Evan had seen in Shadow a rare instinct. The ability to read human signals, to understand meaning hidden in posture and gaze. Months of training and dozens of missions had forged that instinct into a seamless bond. Here, in the damp scent of rotting wood and the chill bleeding from concrete walls, that bond was their sharpest weapon. Evan inhaled deeply, stepped aside and let Shadow take the line. A sharp slicing motion of his hand was all it took. Shadow's eyes sparked, his body flowing lower, nose skimming the floor, moving like a quiet, unstoppable current. Inside, the sounds shifted. The captor's footsteps stopped as if he'd sensed something. A chair scraped. The chain rattled harder. Evan knew. They were out of time. "Go," he snapped, his voice low but edged with command, and slammed his shoulder into the brittle wood. The door splintered with a sharp crack, and Shadow surged through, first a black streak cutting into the dark. Evan followed, close flashlight beam, slicing a clean white path through the dust. The room exploded into motion. In the stark light, Clara sat bound, her chair chained hard to the floor. The man turned sharply, shock flashing across his face. Shadow had already placed himself between Clara and her captor, not attacking yet, but standing like a living barrier. Muscles coiled, eyes locked on the threat. Evan stepped forward, his voice calm and certain. "It ends here." In the thick air, heavy with rust, his choice shifted the balance. No waiting for backup, no measuring time. Only the pure, wordless coordination of a man and a dog, forged by years of trust. And in Clara's eyes, somewhere deep, the spark of hope flared alive. The darkness inside the warehouse pressed in like a black fog, broken only by the narrow blade of Evan's light. The chain clinked over and over, the metallic beat matching the room's tension, mixing with Clara's quick breaths and the slow, steady draw of Shadow's. At Evan's signal, Shadow surged forward, his black frame skimming the ice-cold cement. His paws carried him in rapid, silent strides, weaving between teetering stacks of crates through air thick with sawdust and the sharp tang of oil. Each claw tap on the floor echoed back from the concrete walls, a drumbeat pushing them forward. The flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb in the corner cast shadows that stretched and swayed, shifting like living things. Loose wires dangled from the ceiling, clinking together when the wind slipped through the wall's cracks. A thin, eerie sound cutting through the silence. Shadow gathered himself, muscles rolling under the sleek black coat. He angled his body, slipping past a rusted rack, heading straight toward a frosted glass door blocking a side passage. Beyond, the glass light from outside spilled in, a muted yellow speckled by years of clinging dust. Evan ran close behind his flashlight, sweeping the corners as he moved. In the beam, abandoned wooden crates flashed past inside them, rusted tools, coils of chain, and scraps of torn fabric. From deeper within came the clatter of a chain, louder, more deliberate now, as if the captor were fortifying something or moving Clara to a new position. Shadow reached the glass door first. Without a heartbeat's pause, he drove forward, shoulders low, his body arcing in perfect form. The sharp crack of shattering glass rang out, shards spraying into the air and catching the light before clattering to the floor. The sound ricocheted through the warehouse, mixing with the long metallic shiver of the frame, a signal that the silence was over. Evan followed instantly, stepping through the splintered doorway, boots crunching on the fragments beneath him. Beyond the side entrance, the space was narrower, the ceiling lower, the air thick with damp. Slivers of light fell from high cracks above, catching dust motes suspended in the gloom. Shadow pressed forward down the tight corridor, ears locked ahead, filtering every faint noise. Evan stayed on his heels, feeling the shift in the air. Now the metallic drag was clearer, underscored by the labored breathing of a man. They veered left, where a section of the wall had collapsed, opening into a broader chamber. This was the warehouse's heart, chaotic and suffocating. Rusted shelving leaned like broken ribs. Crates were stacked and ready to topple the floor, littered with splintered wood, snarled wiring, and slick patches of oil catching a dull glow. In the far corner, Clara's figure came into view, still bound, her chair anchored with a heavy chain. The captor stood just behind her, one hand gripping the chain, the other holding something that glinted dully. The chain rattled in his grip, each coil on the floor, whispering like a snake in motion. Shadow froze in the shadows, his body a solid block of readiness. Evan crouched, placing a light hand at his neck, feeling the steady, powerful beat beneath the thick fur. Their eyes met. Pure, unshakable trust passing between them. From this vantage, they were close enough to act, but still far enough to require precision. Evan's focus narrowed until the rest of the room blurred. Only the scene ahead remained in sharp relief. Clara sat motionless in a battered chair, wrists and ankles bound in steel links that caught the weak sway of the single bulb overhead. Angry red marks marred her skin. Her chest rose and fell quickly. Directly behind her, the man loomed like a wall. One hand pinned her shoulder, the other held a long-bladed knife, its silver edge hovering at her neck. One careless move could cut deep. His breath came hot and fast, reeking of stale tobacco, pressing into the air around her like a physical weight. Evan hid behind a steel rack, eyes locked on the tableau. Time was collapsing. Each second another step toward the edge. Calculations sparked and resolved in his head, distance, angle, the path Shadow could take without endangering Clara. Shadow stood close, his breathing even, but his gaze a slow burning flame. Ears pricked, his frame lowered, every muscle set for the break. Evan's hand pressed again to the taut line of his shoulders, feeling the coil of strength beneath. The faint scrape of the knife brushing against the metal links at Clara's collar jolted through Evan like a needle. The captor's voice cut sharp, ordering anyone outside to stop where they were. He twisted the blade, sending a flash of steel across her throat that made cold sweat bead along her temple. Evan knew. One wrong beat, and it was over. He signaled Shadow to shift left, taking a new line of approach. The dog melted into the dark between racks, silent as moving air. Evan followed in a wide arc, each footstep no more than the whisper of cloth on concrete, his own pulse hammering in his ears. The air in the warehouse pressed down thick with the smells of oil, old dust, and rust. Overhead, the flickering fluorescent light flared, throwing the captor's shadow across Clara until it nearly swallowed her whole. Evan glanced toward Shadow. The dog was crouched behind a low wooden crate now, only meters from the target. His stance was set, focus so absolute, the world seemed reduced to the single path ahead. 1 second. 2. Time stretched. Evan drew a deep breath, then tipped his chin in the barest nod. Shadow launched like an arrow from the string, black muscle cutting through the haze. The snap of his claws on the cement was the only warning before the captor's head whipped around. Too late. Shadow's jaws clamped hard on the knife hand, the grip crushing until the blade dropped with a ringing crack to the floor. Evan was already in motion, breaking from cover, slamming into the captor with his full weight. The man staggered back into the rack, rattling it from top to bottom. Clara pitched forward, eyes wide, fear giving way to a rising spark of relief. Before the echo of the knife hitting the floor faded, Evan had the man's arm pinned, driving him to the ground and holding him there. Shadow stood planted before Clara, his stance a wall between her and any further threat. In that instant, Evan knew they had reached the pivot point of the entire chase. The place where timing, skill, and the bond between man and dog converged to pull someone back from the brink. And as Clara's breathing steadied, he knew they had reclaimed the most precious thing of all her life. The air inside the warehouse seemed to stretch each sound, lingering longer than it should. Half hidden behind the steel shelving, Evan kept his eyes locked on every twitch and shift from the captor. The man stood squarely behind Clara's shoulder, pinning her in place, the knife in his grip, a cold, unwavering threat. The steel blade caught the dim, erratic flicker from the overhead fluorescent bulb, painting the scene in a thin, unnerving light. Low to the ground, Shadow crouched in the dark pocket between rotting wooden crates. His gaze never left the target, every line of his body coiled with potential energy. Each breath he drew seemed to match Evan's own heartbeat. Both of them were waiting for the single perfect second to act. A gust slid through a crack in the wall, knocking two dangling wires together with a faint metallic click. The captor glanced back, distracted for the briefest instant. Evan seized it, giving a sharp downward hand signal, followed by a slight tilt to the right. Shadow moved at once. He eased back a step, then slipped soundlessly through a narrow gap between shelving units, circling to the opposite side of the man. Within seconds he had closed in from a blind angle, his paws silent enough to vanish beneath the faint rattle of the chain. Clara lifted her head, her wide, frantic eyes flashing with sudden recognition when she caught sight of the black silhouette approaching from behind. She understood. Something was coming, and her chance was almost here. With only a few strides left, Shadow sank lower, muscles rippling under his coat. His ears angled forward, tail balancing his stance. Then, like an arrow loosed from a bow, he launched, every ounce of weight driving toward the target. His jaws clamped onto the knife hand, white teeth locking with a precision and force that left the man no time to react. A sharp cry of pain tore from the captor, the knife falling to the cement with a ringing crack that cut through the thick air. Evan exploded from cover, driving his shoulder into the man and forcing him back into the shelving. The impact rattled the stacked crates, sending dust cascading down in a fine drifting shower. In one smooth motion, Evan turned, seized the man's free arm, and wrenched him to the floor, pinning him hard. Shadow released, but remained planted between Clara and the threat, his breath quick but steady. His eyes locked and unblinking. Clara trembled, yet her gaze was clear now, following every movement of her rescuers. The chain around her rattled softly with each shake of her body, but the fear that had dominated her expression was giving way to something else: hope. Pressing the man down, Evan's voice came low and firm. "It's over." For a beat, everything stilled. The labored breathing, the dim light, the thick smell of oil and rust, and the steady warmth of Shadow's presence. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks again, lifting specks of dust into the pale shaft of light that crept into the room. To Evan, it was more than a sign of victory. It was a confirmation of the unbreakable link between him and his partner, the bond that had saved a life in a matter of seconds. The clang of the dropped blade still echoed when silence followed, giving everyone a moment to absorb what had just happened. The man slumped under Evan's hold, breath ragged and spent. Shadow remained a living wall in front of Clara, his dark frame, solid eyes blazing with watchfulness. Evan's quick sweep confirmed the scene was secure. He kicked the knife further out of reach, then turned to Clara. His hands found the cold chain wrapped around her. Each pull scraped against the floor, the metal biting into her wrists and ankles had left deep red marks in the delicate skin. The final lock clicked free, and the chain slid away with a soft clatter. Clara flinched, as if an unseen weight had lifted from her body. Evan caught her as she swayed his steady hands, keeping her upright. From the shattered pane Shadow had leapt through earlier, a sliver of daylight spilled in. It wasn't bright, but it painted a warm gold streak across the dim warehouse. Dust motes floated in the beam, spinning slowly in the draft, turning the moment almost dreamlike. Clara blinked against the light, her pupils tightening. She looked to Evan, then down to Shadow. Her eyes shimmered, her hand trembling as she reached out. Shadow stepped closer, his nose brushing her palm, his warmth seeping into her skin until tears welled in her eyes. Evan stayed beside her, his hand light on her shoulder, feeling the rhythm of her breathing settle, the trembling of her frame begin to ease. For a moment, the three of them shared the same heartbeat, human and dog bound together by trust, courage, and a deep, wordless gratitude. Without thinking, Clara wrapped both arms around Shadow, pressing her face into his thick, warm coat. He stood still, letting her release everything she had held in through those harrowing hours. His eyes closed slowly, his breathing calm, as if he understood that embrace was the greatest thanks she could give. Evan bent, wrapping both of them into his own arms. The strain of the mission, the knife-edge minutes, all of it dissolved in the heat of holding Clara and Shadow close. These were the moments that made the risks worth it, the reason for every hour of training and every step into danger. The light from the window grew, as the sun climbed higher, spilling over Clara's tear-bright eyes, glinting on the gleam of Shadow's coat. Everything felt cleansed, as if the long night had finally broken. From outside, the wail of a rescue vehicle began to carry toward them, drawing closer with every second. Evan lifted his head, his gaze steady but softened by relief. In just minutes, they would step fully out of this darkness. But before stepping out, Evan allowed himself and his partner to savor a little more of that rare stillness, a place where light, warmth, and life had finally met again after a breathless, perilous journey. The slam of the rescue vehicle's door echoed in the misty morning, marking the closing chapter of a long, dangerous night. The engine rumbled to life, its low growl blending with the steady crunch of tires over loose gravel as they rolled down the narrow lane leading away from the abandoned warehouse. The sound was rhythmic, almost like the heartbeat that still hadn't quite slowed in the chests of everyone inside. Clara sat in the middle row, bracketed between Evan and Shadow. Her hands trembled faintly, fingers still icy, as if her body had yet to believe it was truly free from that place. On her left, Evan's solid frame created an invisible shield. On her right, Shadow sat tall, his posture unwavering like a living wall that nothing could pass. Morning light filtered through the glass, glancing across Clara's face and bringing a soft gleam to her eyes, even with the shadow of exhaustion still lingering there. She reached out, brushing her fingertips through Shadow's jet-black fur, letting the warmth seep into her chilled skin like a quiet stream flowing back into her. Shadow's eyes slid toward her for a moment, ears twitching slightly before returning to the passing world beyond the window. Evan noticed. Shadow had not fully relaxed since climbing into the vehicle. His back remained straight, shoulders taut, eyes scanning the road edges as if any movement could become a threat. It was the instinct of a warrior who had learned that every second mattered. The vehicle's radio murmured softly. The driver announced that Clara's family had been contacted and was on their way to the hospital. Clara's lips trembled as though she might speak. But instead, she leaned closer to Shadow, her breath brushing the thick fur along his neck. Evan caught the movement and smiled faintly. He knew that after what Clara had endured, Shadow was more than a guardian. He was the anchor she needed to feel safe again. Every glance from the dog seemed to remind her that rescue did not end at the moment of escape, but only when the rescued heart could breathe in peace once more. Outside, the road to the main street began to take shape. The sun was stronger now, laying long bands of light across the windows. Familiar storefronts and houses slowly replaced the rusted fences and crumbling walls of the warehouse district. The smell of dust gave way to the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting from a corner bakery, carried in by a hint of warm morning air. Clara looked out, then back, first to Evan, then to Shadow. Amid all the changing scenery, the dog's watchful eyes stayed fixed ahead as though his mission had not paused for a single moment. Evan leaned slightly, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was low, firm. "We're almost somewhere safe." She gave a small nod, the curve of a quiet but warm smile forming at her lips. Shadow kept his gaze locked forward, but his ears eased down just a little, a subtle signal that he too felt the weight lifting from the air. The vehicle turned onto the boulevard. Sunlight streamed in at an angle, bathing the cabin in gold. In that glow, the image of Clara seated between Evan and Shadow etched itself into memory, proof of courage, camaraderie, and a bond beyond words. At the end of the street, the hospital came into view like a bright, steadfast refuge. Yet Shadow's eyes still searched the road, as if a sentinel could never abandon his post. The hospital room was awash in soft white light, the faint scent of antiseptic drifting in the air. Clara sat propped against a pillow near the window, a thin bandage still wrapped around her wrist and ankle. Her family had gathered, her mother at her side gripping her hand tightly, her father standing near the foot of the bed, relief and emotion mingling in his eyes. Evan and Shadow took their place in the corner. Shadow lay on his side with his head resting across Evan's outstretched legs, but his ears still flicked now and then, attuned to faint noises from the hallway. His gaze, calm yet vigilant, lingered on Clara, as though confirming again that she was safe. A local news reporter and cameraman entered with the family's permission. The camera was set at a respectful distance, the soft light from the rig adding brightness without stealing the room's warmth. Clara glanced at Evan, seeking that final reassurance before speaking. He gave a small nod. Her voice began softly hesitant, but gained strength as she continued. "When I was trapped in that room, I knew if I just stayed still, no one might reach me in time. I remembered lessons from school when we learned safety signals, especially the letter X, the sign for help when you can't speak." She paused, eyes dropping briefly to her hands before lifting again. "I scratched an X onto the table, and later, when I heard movement outside the crack in the door, I shaped the X clearly with both hands. I didn't know if anyone would see, but then I caught sight of eyes in that thin strip of light, and I knew there was hope. Her mother wiped away a tear quickly, while her father nodded slowly, pressing his lips together against the swell of feeling. Clara's smile this time was steadier as she turned toward Evan and Shadow. If it hadn't been for Evan and Shadow, I wouldn't be here. Shadow recognized my signal, and Evan trusted him enough to follow it to me. I've never seen a look as focused, as full of determination as Shadow's was that day. The camera panned slowly to the dog. Shadow lifted his head, the light catching across his sleek black coat, the image of him sharper, stronger for it. The reporter's voice lowered as she addressed the viewers, rich with emotion. A story of courage and the unshakable bond between a person and a working dog. A reminder that even the smallest signal can be the lifeline that saves a life. Word of what had happened began to spread. In the hospital corridor, a few people passing by recognized Shadow and Evan exchanging glances of quiet admiration. A nurse paused just long enough to gently stroke Shadow's head before returning to her work, while a little boy tugged his mother's hand, urging her closer so he could watch the dog from a safe distance. Clara's family never stopped expressing their gratitude. Her mother embraced Evan with a sincerity that made her voice tremble. "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." Evan only shook his head slightly, his eyes turning toward Shadow. It was him. I was just along for the ride. Clara let out a soft laugh, a tear shimmering at the corner of her eye, while the camera kept rolling, capturing a moment in which everyone understood that the eyes of a dog had seen what words could never truly express. Outside, the sunlight had risen high, streaming through the window and scattering golden patterns across the floor. In that warm light, Clara's story had just begun to travel far beyond these walls. Not simply as news, but as a message of hope, trust, and the power of signals so small they could have been missed. That afternoon, when the hospital had grown quieter and the reporters had left, Evan and Shadow found a small courtyard behind the building to breathe in the fresh air. The sky was brushed with a pale blue clouds drifting lazily overhead, the late-day sun casting a golden sheen over Shadow's black coat. He lay beside the bench head, resting on Evan's leg, eyes half closed, yet ears still twitching faintly, tuned to the distant murmur of the world. Evan's hand moved slowly down Shadow's back, feeling the sleek line of fur beneath his fingers. His mind drifted back to that instant in the warehouse, the way Shadow's gaze had locked on the narrow crack beneath the door and lingered longer than usual. Evan remembered it clearly, a gaze that was sharp, unwavering, as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only one signal worth noticing. He closed his eyes, letting the memory replay in full detail. His own heart had been pounding with the pressure of the mission, but Shadow had moved before he could even give a command. That reflex, quicker than thought, had opened the door to saving Clara. A faint smile crossed his face as he recalled their early days of training. Shadow hadn't been a natural star. On the first day, he had hesitated, even at the simplest hand signals, often glancing up at Evan as if to ask, "What exactly do you mean?" But day by day, patience and persistence began to shape something unshakable between them. Evan had spent countless hours teaching Shadow to notice the smallest cues in human behavior. The flicker of an eye, the tightening of a fist, the subtle shift in breathing. All signals a skilled K9 had to read. He built scenarios thick with distractions so that Shadow could learn to sift through noise and focus on what mattered. Once Evan had led him into an old warehouse filled with layered scents. Machine oil, rust, food, even artificial traces of strangers. Somewhere hidden, a colleague would signal with just a flick of the hand through a crack in the door. At first, it took Shadow nearly 10 minutes to find it. Weeks later, he could lock onto it in under 30 seconds. Those sessions had carved the reflex into Shadow's instincts, trust the training act when the opening appeared, even if no words came. That was why in that warehouse Shadow had acted with flawless precision without waiting for permission. Looking down now, Evan found Shadow still lying there, occasionally lifting his gaze to make sure he was exactly where he should be. "You've done better than I could have hoped," old friend Evan murmured. The rustle of leaves overhead blended into the quiet peace of the moment. Yet in Evan's mind, the image of Shadow leaping forward to seize the kidnapper's arm was as vivid as the instant it happened. He knew it would remain that way. Not just as a memory of a mission accomplished, but as proof of a bond built through absolute trust, endless hours of work, and those silent moments only two partners could share. The next morning, the courtyard of the police department was set simply but warmly. A white banner stretched wide bore the bold words, "Honoring a Hero," framed by the deep blue emblem of the force. Beneath the clear sky, rows of chairs stood neatly arranged officers in crisp uniforms, taking their places. In the front row, Evan sat beside Shadow. The black-coated dog sat tall and steady, ears pricked high, as if he knew this day belonged to him. His coat gleamed in the early sun, every hair neatly brushed. When someone passed by, he would tilt his head slightly, his gaze calm, yet bright. The very same look he wore on duty. Clara's family sat among the guests, her light blue dress catching the morning light. Her eyes softened each time they met Shadow's, a small smile tugging at her lips, a silent thank you all over again. The ceremony began with the deep, steady beat of a drum. The commanding officer stepped to the podium, his voice both proud and warm. "Today we gather to honor the courage and devotion of a very special member of our team. A four-legged partner carrying a heart as steadfast as any in our ranks." He recounted the rescue in brief pausing on the moment Shadow spotted the hand signal X and reacted instantly, setting in motion the chain of events that brought Clara home. Every word held the crowd's attention, eyes turning toward the dog in admiration and affection. Finally, the moment arrived. An officer approached carrying a plaque of recognition and a small medal made especially for service dogs. Evan crouched, steadying Shadow as the medal was fastened around his neck, glinting in the light, while the plaque was placed in Evan's hands, a symbol that the honor belonged equally to both partners. The applause broke out in a warm, rolling wave, punctuated by a few cheerful whistles. Some of the officers nearby couldn't hide their proud smiles. Evan glanced at Shadow, who still sat in perfect posture, ears alert, eyes wide, but with a faint wag of his tail. A small sign, yet enough for Evan to know the dog felt the special weight of this moment. Clara stepped onto the stage, her voice trembling yet steady. "If Shadow hadn't seen my signal that day, and if Evan hadn't placed absolute trust in him, I don't know what would have happened. I'll always remember the moment those eyes found me and the safety that washed over me." Her words drew quiet nods, and a few people blinked rapidly to hold back tears. As Clara stepped down, a young female officer reached out to gently stroke Shadow's head and whispered, "You really are a hero." The ceremony ended with everyone rising to their feet, the applause lasting even longer, as if no one wished for it to fade. Evan bent down toward Shadow and murmured, "We did well, old friend." Under the brilliant gold of the morning sun, the sight of the man and his dog Bai standing together on the podium became a memory everyone would carry with them. A reminder that courage knows no shape or language, only the heartbeat that stays true to its companions and its mission to protect. In the days after the ceremony, life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Clara had been discharged from the hospital and was steadily recovering. Each morning, sunlight spilled through her window, drawing a bright line across the floor, stirring the same warmth she had once thought she would never feel again. Though her body still carried traces of weakness, each step she took now held a quiet strength, born from the trust and hope rekindled after the darkest days. One weekend afternoon, Clara arrived at Evan's K9 training facility on the outskirts of town. The place was surrounded by wide fields and tall trees whispering in the wind. From a distance, she spotted Evan and Shadow training on the main field. The jet-black dog surged forward with powerful strides, eyes locked on Evan's hand. Signals then pivoted sharply to leap over a wooden barrier and slip through a tunnel. The moment Shadow saw Clara, his ears shot upright, his tail sweeping eagerly. Without waiting for Evan's command, he ran straight to her. Each step strong but measured, and stopped just short, lifting his head as if to ask, "Are you all right?" Clara knelt, wrapping her arms around his neck, breathing in his familiar warmth and steady heartbeat. "I think he's missed you," Evan said with a smile as he approached. "So have I. I owe you both more than words can say," Clara replied, her gaze filled with gratitude. From then on, Clara began visiting regularly. At first, she simply watched, but gradually she joined in the lighter exercises, tossing a ball for Shadow to retrieve or holding up the signal equipment. Each time the dog bounded away like an arrow and returned with expectant eyes. Clara could feel the invisible thread binding them. Some evenings, the three of them walked through the fields behind the training ground. The sun dipped slowly, drenching the sky in red, while the air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and damp earth. Clara shared with Evan how the ordeal had changed her, how she now cherished small things. A family meal, birdsong at dawn, or simply the feel of her hand resting on Shadow's smooth coat. Evan listened quietly, nodding now and then. He knew that what Clara had endured would always be etched into her memory. But these calm, unhurried days were the truest healing. Shadow seemed to sense it too, always walking just close enough to guard her, yet leaving space for her to move forward on her own. One June evening, as training wrapped up, Evan handed Clara an old K9 collar, its metal plate engraved with the words, "Trust in the silent bond." "This was the collar Shadow wore during his very first sessions," he said. "I think you should keep it, as a reminder that sometimes the connections we can't put into words can change an entire story." Clara's fingers closed tightly around the collar, her eyes glistening. She looked toward Shadow, who sat calmly in the amber light, his eyes reflecting the colors of the setting sun. In that instant, she knew their bond had grown into something permanent, something that would outlive a single rescue mission. Peace, she realized, wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about walking forward with those who had faced it by your side. And in every step ahead, there would always be the rhythm of a black dog's paws, moving in quiet harmony beside her. That evening, the sky looked as if painted by a master's brush, streaks of orange, pink, and violet stretching across the horizon. The last light of day poured over the K9 training grounds, gilding the wooden fences, the rows of training posts, and the endless green fields beyond. Evan sat on the wooden steps of the office, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Shadow lay stretched out beside him, head resting on Evan's knee, eyes half closed as he savored the cool evening breeze. His black fur shimmered with gold, where the sunlight grazed it, making him appear both unyielding and deeply at peace. Farther away, Clara leaned casually against the fence, the coiled training lead in her hand, a soft smile curving her lips. The wind played gently with her hair, and her eyes caught the glow of twilight. Looking at them, Evan's steady shadow, loyal, the open sky beyond, she felt a serenity unlike any she had known before. They didn't need many words that afternoon. Sometimes Clara would walk over, sit beside them, and rest her hand on Shadow's neck. The dog would open his eyes, meet hers briefly, then close them again, as if listening to the steady rhythm of the two hearts he had come to trust. The early summer cicadas hummed in the trees, mingling with the scent of cut grass and faint coffee. Evan felt the seconds slow, each breath fuller than the last. After all the strain, the sweat, and the moments that brushed against danger, this peace felt like the most fitting reward. Clara spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. "I never thought there would be a day I'd be sitting here feeling this peaceful. Evan glanced at her and smiled. It's moments like this that give us the strength to keep going. Shadow shifted, stretching before rising to his feet, ears pricking forward. Both Evan and Clara noticed immediately. The dog's gaze locked on the training grounds gate where a patrol vehicle had just come to a stop. The door swung open, and an officer stepped out, his expression serious. The radio on the car crackled to life, its urgent tone slicing through the tranquil air. K-9 unit needed immediately incident in the southern sector. Evan rose at once, setting his coffee cup down. Clara stepped back, eyes following their every move. Shadow was already poised, standing tall, muscles taut beneath his sleek coat. Eyes sharp and focused, like an arrow ready to be loosed. Evan turned to Clara, his voice steady yet warm. We'll be back. Clara nodded, understanding this was their calling. She watched as Evan and Shadow moved toward the vehicle, their steps quick but unwavering. The setting sun wrapped around them, stretching their shadows long across the ground. The door closed, the engine roared to life, and within seconds they had disappeared around the bend leading to the main road. On the training field, the wind still carried the scent of grass, and the last golden light of the day still bathed everything in warmth. Yet in the air lingered a quiet anticipation, the sense that a new story, a new mission was about to unfold. And somewhere out there, someone was in need of a sharp gaze, a courageous heart, and that silent bond between a man and a dog, named Shadow. The story of Evan, Shadow, and Clara is not only one of thrilling rescues, but a living testament to the power of trust, friendship, and loyalty. In Shadow's keen eyes and steady stride, one can see the brave heart of the German Shepherd, a breed not only strong and intelligent, but capable of loving and protecting humans with both instinct and devotion. What Shadow accomplished was made possible not just by training, but by the unique connection with Evan, an invisible thread woven from time, patience, and mutual respect. It is a reminder that love and care for animals are never in vain. On the contrary, they can become the very force that changes a destiny. Every dog, whether a working partner or a family companion, carries within them an ability to sense and understand, far beyond what we imagine. When we offer kindness and respect, we receive unwavering loyalty in return, a bond unshaken by condition or gain. The story closes, but the image remains, Evan and Shadow walking into the sunset, ready for whatever comes next. It is a reminder that out there, silent heroes still move among us, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, quietly protecting, warming, and bringing hope to the world.